good evening about white rum, and principally why it's a bit of a nonsense term. And we're going to explore various different aspects of that. So first of all, who is this strange bearded Englishman sitting in his study at home? I'm Nick. I work for the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, and I'm in charge of all the spirits qualifications that we run. And I've kind of, my most recent kind of big piece of work was to create and kind of and launch the level 3 award in spirits, which came out last August. So we're still kind of working through that, kind of rolling that out. So that was a really fun thing to do. So that's kind of the role. I've been really working kind of very deeply with spirits now for, gosh, 8, 9 or so years. As our company has grown, we kind of, other people came in on the wine side, so I don't really deal with that anymore. So really spirits and to a little bit sake is my kind of focus these days. So what we're going to do is, this is going to be broken into 5 bits. There's going to be kind of an introductory section, and then we're going to be looking at 4 individual rums, and we're using them as jump off points to kind of explore style and how certain things come about. So at the end of each section, would seem like the sensible place to pause if there are any questions. So what we would ask that you do is that if you do have any questions, if you can put them into the chat, and my colleague Lydia, who will be following along, will be able to kind of siphon them through to me so that I'm kind of focusing on the presentation as we go along. So we've got an introduction, and then we've got, as I say, those 4 rums. So without further ado, let's get going. So what am I trying to do this evening? Well, I'm trying to kind of demonstrate one very important kind of point, and these 2 things are combined, and it's that making an unaged spirit, or something that has only been short aged, whether that's in stainless steel or in an inert vessel or for a short period in wood, is an end point in itself. And I think it can be kind of an impression some people can have, rightly or wrongly. It's a bit of a straw man list, but that the act of aging is the thing that gives quality, gives complexity, and it's the unaged thing is just, you know, something on the margins on the side. Now, I would argue that that is just absolutely fundamentally not true. You have to though make the spirit with the objective of the fact that this isn't going to be unaged. So how you make it will actually vary slightly. It will vary from how you would sort of distill a product which you know you're going to age, but short aged spirits are in and of themselves a very, very valid endpoint. And you can get, as I hopefully will demonstrate, and if some of you have got rums at home, that would be great, but there is an enormous amount of diversity that you can generate within this: quality, complexity, and the lot. So it really is a delightful thing. And I'm a great fan of unwooded spirits. I just find that they are to a degree underrated, which I think is a little bit of a shame. Now, what we are going to explore also is we're going to explore some of the factors that are kind of try that again. We're going to explore some of the factors that account for why these spirits are tasting the way that they are. They are quite radically different, and there are ways that we can look at that and explain that. I am going to deal with some degree of technicality here. So I'm going to have to assume some degree of knowledge on part of everyone here. But if you are getting a bit stuck, then we can maybe have sort of deal with that in the Q&A. But we can explain some of it. I'm going to have to also say that I can't go the full kind of like 9 yards into the full depth of it, because we just don't have the time. Along the way, we're going to call out myths, or we're going to like look at things, sort of different assertions, and say, well, actually, is this valid? Is this not? The first one we can deal with is the fact that white rum in and itself is a very unhelpful way of classifying these spirits, because, okay, they all have no color, but they are so stylistically diverse that actually it doesn't really help you in any way as a consumer, or indeed as a seller. And I really must emphasize that this is a snapshot. So I'm using 4 rums. These are 4 rums that I like, and I think there are 4 rums that demonstrate a number of interesting facets of this particular category. But for example, I'm not going to show a cachaça. I'm not going to show some of these interesting kind of combination things that are happening now. Depending on which part of the world you're in, it's called Probitas or Veritas. Kind of the combination work that happens between Foursquare and Hamden. Really, really kind of interesting collaboration there. Or say some of the exciting things coming out of Mexico, like Paranubes, or indeed some of the amazing American rums. So this is just a snapshot. and it's not meant to be encyclopedic. So I just want to put that caveat in before we get cracking. Now, what I want to do is I want to start off by doing a very kind of an overview of certain facets of rum production, and how I'm going to talk about spirit production, just so that we're all on a relatively even playing field. There are different ways in which this can be done. So if you kind of understand where I'm coming from, it's going to make it a lot easier when I kind of go in and talk specifically about each of the individual spirits themselves. So for some of you, this might be a little bit kind of like cat, sat and mat, but I think it's good to make sure that we're all at least kind of have the same set of reference frames. So here we go into part one. So why is it not moving on? Here we go. So I like to think about spirits production that there are 4 stages of spirits production. You're going to start off with the raw material and you're going to end up with the spirit. I mean, so far so obvious. And what we have to consider next is, well, we need to process that raw material to make a sugary liquid. Now, that's normally what we're after. When we're looking at Asian spirits, that can be a little bit more complicated, but typically we're looking for a sugary liquid. Now with sugarcane, that's pretty straightforward, although there are complications along the way. But we need this sugary liquid, because if we don't have that, then we can't get on to stage 2. The other thing to bear in mind about the raw material is that, again, stating the obvious to an extent, raw materials give you a very distinct set of aromas. Rums are very identifiable because of the sugar cane that's used, same way that whiskey is very identifiable by the grains, fruit spirits by the fruits that are used. So the raw material is a very important source of identifying aromas. And actually there is some complexity in that, which is presented by how sugar cane is processed. Next up is alcoholic fermentation. This just has to happen. This is how the alcohol is created. Now, clearly ethanol is being produced in significant quantities, and the bulk of what is in any alcoholic beverage is ethanol and water. That's the bulk of it. Fermentation also can create aroma and flavor. And in certain situations in rum production, it can create bountiful quantities of this stuff. So it is a very important source of flavor in all manner of beverage production. It's certainly the case in spirits production. Now, once we've got an alcoholic liquid, and these are going to be vary in strength between something like 5 up to 10, maybe a little bit higher. Not necessarily that strong, but strengths will vary. We obviously then, unsurprisingly, we need to go through the distillation process. Now, the thing about distillation is that I always like to focus on 2 words with distillation. We can get caught down in the technicalities literally until the cows come home. But the 2 key words are selection and concentration. You take a liquid, and out of that liquid, you want a certain piece of that liquid. That's what you're going to select. And also in selecting it, you're discarding other things and you're kind of magnifying it, you're concentrating it. And that's really the dual purpose of distillation. It's not a I'm going to concentrate everything, which kind of happens if there is a thing called ice distillation, which that happens in ice distillation, but this is hot distillation. So it is a selection and a concentration. And out of this, we're going to get a spirit. Now, some of the ones that we're looking at today, one of them was distilled to 55.9, others would have been distilled north of 90. So again, a significant range in that, and that will have a very significant impact on style. Last but not least, now we're not really looking at this significantly today, but post-distillation operations. So looking at this in the broadest spectrum of terms, we can adjust the color, we can change the color, we can go to the color shop, we can add oak. I mean, there are various ways of doing that. We can add aroma. I mean, oak is an aroma that could be added post-distillation, gins and all sorts of other things. You can add many different aromas. We can affect the sweetness. Now, any spirit that comes off the still is dry, and all of the spirits I'm tasting today are dry. I don't particularly want to get kind of down the rabbit hole of sweetness and rum. All the spirits I'm trying today are dry. But sweetness is something that would always be added post-distillation. And you can adjust the alcoholic strength. I mean, this would be going down. It would be by a dilution process. Most things are bottled at somewhere in the region of 40% ABV. But a number of the spirits I'm trying to try today aren't, but most are. And that only happens, that's possible because of dilution. You're adding water to bring the alcoholic strength down. So that's my kind of frames of reference. Now, here is a sugarcane field. I'm kind of this is a bit of a cheat. This is in Kagoshima prefecture in Japan. This is in the Amami Islands. So, but a very good friend of mine went there, and these are actually quite good photographs, so I could use them quite easily. Sugarcane is a grass. It's a perennial plant, and it has these very long tall stems, which are kind of in plant terms armor plated, and they have lots of leaves around them. And within that hard kind of stem is the store of sugar. It's sucrose mostly, and that's where they store it. They don't need to, because they grow in very hot climates. There's ample amounts of photosynthesis. They don't really need to kind of store it as a more complex carbohydrate. So on the left there, you can see a more of a close-up of the unharvested cane. And here on the right, you can see a cane field, partly that's been partly processed. And you can see, you can't quite get completely the sense of scale, but this is actually, I mean, I'm 6'1" and a bit, just around about 2 meters, depending on kind of what kind of system you use. This would kind of tower significantly above me. So I mean, it's a big, tall plant. So that's sugarcane. Now then, what we need to look at very quickly now is how we process sugarcane. I can't go into all of the details of this, but at least the basic operations of how this is going to function we can cover. So first thing we're going to get with sugarcane is that we need to get the sweetness out of it, and we do that by essentially crushing it. And there are pretty scary bits of machinery that are going to do this. This is a hard plant exterior, and it needs some pretty strong machines to break it up, and they do. And out of this, you are going to get sugarcane juice, which is sweet juice, literally. And you can very simply add yeast, fermentation, and off we go. And that is a way in which you can make rum. And two of the rums that I'm going to talk about today, are made that way. They are made from cane juice. Now, the reality is that most sugarcane is grown for the purposes of sugar production. And so most of this cane juice is going to go off to some kind of sugar processing. Now, essentially and this is cutting a very long story short, essentially what you're doing when you're processing cane juice is that you are evaporating off water. And as you evaporate off water, the sugar within it is going to crystallize out, and then that can go off for further processing. And you're left behind with a varying degrees of residue. So the first thing that will come out from this is a thing called cane syrup, which is sometimes called high test molasses, sometimes it's called cane honey. It has a variety of different names. It is used in various different ways in the Caribbean. And this is where you've just removed some of the water and it becomes a much more stable product. After cane syrup, you then get various different grades of molasses, which are then, the molasses is what's left over, the sugar is what comes out. Now the sugar that comes out from this is what's called, in various different terms, boiled brown sugar, real brown sugar. This is the squidgy soft stuff that when you open it up really smells like toffee, caramel, brown. It's delightful. And actually it's it's sugar which has got the coating in it which makes it brown is the thing that's giving you all those aromas, and that's in fact molasses kind of on the exterior. So when you get to white sugar, it's gone through a whole heap of other processing to remove all that out. You can of course hilariously get brown sugar that is white sugar with caramel coloring added to it to make it brown again. That's the kind of more crystalline stuff that just has no aroma to it. Anyway, I digress. So cane syrup and molasses can be used either in tandem or individually to make rums. Now, the key thing here is that you will need to add water to that to get to a kind of a liquid which is viable for the yeast to operate in. And again, you'd be adding the yeast and we'd be making an alcoholic liquid. Now, if I'm working with cane juice, I'm probably just working with cane juice. If I'm working with molasses, I might have some cane syrup in there. There is a combination. The donkey, which we're going to have, is done that way. Some people will also put in some cane syrup. So it's not complete cane juice, rather. It's not completely clear cut, but typically if you're majority working with molasses, that's really going to be the driver for you. Now, the thing that bear in mind particularly here is, I mean, that's all very well and good, but these things taste different as a result. So this is a stock image of some cane juice. So you can see the cane stems there. Cane juice has this vegetal, grassy, herbaceous kind of a green aromas to it that are very distinct. and very recognizable and decidedly different from stuff that's made from either cane syrup or molasses. Now this is shop bought molasses, which I had a kind of a photograph done of. It's kind of probably much more on the end of blackstrap, which is at the very end of that production process. And you're much more likely to get this kind of array of aromas from molasses. Now, I'm not saying you're absolutely always going to get these things, but these are just kind of useful kind of guidance in terms of like where the flavor profiles will be different and shaped. So cane juice, syrup, molasses, you are just within the raw material getting two quite distinct divergences within style. And hopefully I can demonstrate that. Now, next along we have fermentation. Now this is a fermentation that's taking place in Haiti, in one of the Valier, in one of the Clarin. This is quite a funky fermentation. You can see that they put in bits of the cane plant as well. It's in a wooden vessel. So I'll talk a bit more about that later. But there are just a couple of details. I can't go into the fermentation is a wonderfully interesting subject in and of itself, but we can just touch on a few key points here. So what's produced? Well, ethanol's produced. We know that, and we get a lot of flavour. In particular, there is a group of flavours which are called esters. Now, esters are a really exciting flavour group, and they very broadly and generally have fruity, floral flavours to them. So, for example, if you have isoamyl acetate, which is an ester, isoamyl alcohol with acetic acid. Neither isoamyl alcohol or acetic acid are pleasant in any way, shape or form. Acetic acid vinegar, isoamyl alcohol is not pleasant on its own. Stick them together, you get a lovely banana smell. So although it's a bit of a sidebar, if you smell Jack Daniels and you get that kind of banana smell, that is isoamyl acetate. So they can also vary. If you have really high concentrations of these, they shift, and it's a really fascinating subject, but they are hugely important in rum production and in particular styles of rum production. Now there is an issue of cultured and wild, and you will probably find as I go through this that, you know, I'm going to say this a lot, neither one is better than the other. Cultured yeast are essentially individual strains of yeast that have been selected because they have favorable characteristics. Now, less good intent in that, but it's that they're not per se bad. In the same way that just because you're using wild or ambient yeast, i.e. the yeast that are all around us, we kind of look around us, and you can look around me here, we see, oh, it's air, but there's a huge number of microorganisms in this space here and all over the place, some of which are yeast. So neither's better or worse, they just can offer slightly different kind of possibilities, but we don't necessarily have the time to fully explore that, unfortunately, today. Last but not least, we have this issue of short and long fermentations, which is something that comes up. And the actual alcohol part of that fermentation, like what the yeast generating alcohol, will happen relatively quickly. So if someone's saying I've got a 2 to 3 week fermentation, the alcohol production part of that will have probably happened in relatively short order. It will vary, but a good chunk of that time, the yeast might still be kind of doing a little bit in the background, but there'll be other microorganisms just joining in at that point, and bacteria are very key. And for some of these rums, actually the contribution that these bacteria make to flavor is a very important part of giving us this kind of full-blooded kind of effect. Now, last but not least, quick bit on distillation. I've mentioned this already. We know we need to have some selection and concentration. Everything that comes off a still, this is a rum being made in Massachusetts. Everything that comes off a still is colourless and dry. There's no sugar in it. And the selection is going to be done in various different ways. If we're looking at a batch distillation process, which is mostly done in pots, but can be done in columns, we're doing a selection process across time. And in continuous distillation, which will be done in columns, we're looking at a selection that's done over space. Typically at this point, I make some kind of reference to Time Lords, but apparently not everyone knows what Gallifrey is. Hey ho. Oh, someone does. Hooray, someone's smiling. No, okay. Anyway, so these are the rums that I'm looking at. We've got Don Q Crystal, Rumba Overproof, Clermont Combler, and Clarinet Sajou. And we're going to look at them one at a time, and we're going to explore why they're different. And these are all radically different rums. and yet they would all sit on a shelf potentially as white rum. So they're all very, very different beasts. So as I say, I mean, I think it's a fairly uncontentious statement that the use of white and color references in rum classification is unhelpful. But I'm not necessarily going to suggest there's a better, there's an answer. I'm not here to do that, but I'm here to kind of explore some of that diversity. So let's jump in. Here we go. So first up, we're going to look at the Don Q crystal. Now this is from Puerto Rico, and I've just got one of my little maps here. I've only labeled the countries we're looking at, so Puerto Rico, Martinique, Haiti, and Jamaica. So this is Puerto Rico, which is a little island. It's a US territory. And it's home to two very enormous distilleries. One is Sorales, which is the one we've been looking at, and the other one is Bacardi. So they do produce significant volumes of rum. Now, what do we have with the Don Q that's of interest? So first up, so what are they making it from? Well, they're making it from a combination. So they're making it from blackstrap, and this is then mixed with cane syrup, which they will typically refer to as high test molasses. That's used to give them more fermentable sugar, and it's going to give you this kind of baseline of these toffee caramel kind of flavors in there. So that's what they're working with. Now, they're going to work with their own proprietary yeast strain. So this is something that would have been selected for them, and it's been selected. So when you're selecting a yeast, you kind of think, well, what's my aim for the selection? Now, what they're looking for here is quite a light style of rum, something quite delicate, something not really kind of assertive or forceful. So they're selecting the yeast, so that's going to support that ambition that they have. So that's their own yeast strain, and they're doing it. It's quite a relatively quick fermentation, and it's happening in stainless steel vessels. Now, stainless steel vessels are very easy to clean, and this means that you're not really getting any kind of interference, hopefully, from any kind of ambient bacterial yeast. You want to get something that's very clean and precise from the yeast that you've selected. That's their intention, and they do that very well. Now then, when it comes to the stills that they have at Sorales, they have two still setups. They have their 5-column multi-still setup, which they use to make light marks, and they have a single column Vendome still. Now, Vendome's a steel manufacturer based in Kentucky that supplies the whiskey industry in Kentucky and Tennessee, but they also supply elsewhere. And they use this to make what they would describe as heavy marks. Now, a light mark will be distilled to a much higher strength, and in this case, it's kind of into the low 90s. And the heavy marks would be distilled at a slightly lower strength. I'm not exactly sure what numbers we're looking at there. And they will produce, and they do produce a number of different distillates that would sort of sit in the light side of things and in the heavy side of things. So they're making a lot of different spirits. Now, the other thing that's illegal, it's a legal requirement in Puerto Rico that oak has to be aged for a minimum of 1 year rum has to be aged for a minimum of 1 year in oak barrels. And the crystal's made from stuff that a blend of marks that's been aged for 1.5 to 5 years. And then there's the blending together, and then there's charcoal filtration that will remove any residual color. Now, I don't particularly want to get into the whys and wherefores of why people do that. It's a choice that people make. It's quite common. But what I will talk about is that there are multiple reasons for using oak. There are some very obvious reasons. It will give you color. It will give you flavor. There are other reasons for using it, which concerns kind of oxidation and textural change. And within this broader tradition that you're looking at here, which is, say, examples you'd find in Puerto Rico, examples you might find in Cuba as well, the use of wood is in many ways focused around textural aspects rather than significant aromatic impact. Now, I thought what I would talk about just quickly is about column stills, because people can be very rude about column stills. And I think that's just unfortunate. So this is the 5-column setup at Sorales. Now, they have been quite tight-lipped about exactly how this is set up, and that's absolutely fine. These are very expensive bits of equipment which they will have ordered specifically for their own needs. So I absolutely respect the fact that there's a lot of confidentiality in certain aspects. But what I want to be quite clear about is even with something that looks like this, and it go, oh, it looks a bit like an oil refinery. Well, yes, it does. You know, it's exactly the same basic process that's going on in this as it would in an oil refinery. It's distillation. But you can still make an astonishing variety of high quality spirits using this kind of equipment. And it's entirely wrong to blame the tool when you're going, oh, it's in a column still, it's in a multi-column still, it's distilled to a high strength, therefore nothing. It all very much depends on how good you are at running those stills. And just because something is lighter in style and has a slightly purer, cleaner kind of feel to it, doesn't necessarily mean it's worse or less good than something that's much more robust and powerfully flavored. So I don't know what Seralis has in these stills. They haven't shared, and that's fine. But what I do know is this is a kind of a common arrangement that you would have in a 5-column setup. So I would like to reiterate that I don't know what Seralis has. But this is a fairly common arrangement of 5 stills. They may have some of this stuff, they may not. But the chances are, if you've got 5-column stills looking like that, you're not just looking at rectification in a very simple sense. Now, here we have 2 columns, the stripping column and the rectifying column. Now, the alcohol is going to come into the column number 1. Steam is injected at the bottom fairly commonly. This is a very hot still, and essentially all we're doing here is we're removing anything that's volatile, anything that could potentially be carried over in distillation. And what comes out the bottom is the stuff that is just not volatile, water and other stuff. That in bourbon production is what is essentially backset. So if we follow the green line, the vapors will come from the first still into the second still, and it's in the second still that they will then get separated out across space. So the most volatile parts, which will be the heads, go off the top. The less volatile stuff is the tails, comes out near the bottom, and then you've got a high strength spirit, which is what these things would typically produce, comes out kind of just a bit below the top. That's a fairly standard arrangement. And this orange line here is a recycle of liquid from the bottom of the still number 2 into the top of still number 1. Now, that can make you, I mean, if you've got enough plates in that, you can make a neutral spirit using just that. But there are other kind of distillation techniques that can be used. Now, the hydro selection is one of those things. It is very counterintuitive, so I will very quickly say what it does. You put the high strength, this will have to be followed by a rectifying still, and there's potentially a demethylizer. So let's just have a look at hydro selection. The engineering of this is painfully complicated, so I will just say what it does. You put the high strength spirit in, you put hot water in at the top, steam in at the bottom, and for reasons of the joys of chemistry, the very sort of the very unvolatile, the tailsy stuff comes out the top. I'm not going to explain why, it's just I'd be here for a very long time, but trust me, this is what happens. And you get a very dilute spirit that comes out the bottom of this. Now, this is sometimes used in vodka production. It's also used, you will find one of these stills in Middleton, which is where Jameson is made, all of those whiskies. So this is a technique that is kind of used to kind of make something that's very kind of clean and pure, because you're just removing all of the heavier stuff. Because it's low strength, it needs to be re-rectified. It needs to be taken up to a high strength. So that number 4 is very much exactly the same as number 2. And number 5 is a demethylizer column, which is a way of removing methanol out of a spirit. This is heated using a reboiler, which is essentially a heat exchanger, because you need the spirit to be, for this to work, you need the spirit to be very high strength. So the methanol will come out the top, and you get your very final spirit coming out here at high strength. Now, okay, so that looks like they're going from 1 to 5, but the reality is that they could just use the first 2 columns. They could take the spirit off various different plates in column number 2. So you could have stuff that's more rectified or stuff that's less rectified. You could take it off after 4 rather than going through 5. You could completely skip 3 and 4 and go to 5. So these are incredibly sophisticated pieces of machinery which allow you to produce a lot of different things very precisely. And yes, you can make some god-awful spirit in these, but you can make some god-awful spirit in anything. So, you know, don't blame the tool, blame the person that's using it if you think it's bad. So what do we have with Don Crystal? Now, here's my, here we go, lovely. So I'm going to enjoy this now because I've been talking for a while. Now, the thing that I particularly admire about Don Q is that it's a light style of rum, but it's a light style of rum that has a very kind of clean and precise set of aromas. So you can smell in that, yes, it has that slight smell of alcohol on it, but you can also very clearly smell that molasses base, and you've got this very lovely light kind of apple floral set of aromas from fermentation. Nothing big, nothing punchy, and I don't pick up anything discernibly on oak aromatics in this, but when you try it, and I'm going to take the liberty now, it has this nice kind of creamy round feel to it, and part of that will have been contributed from this kind of period of maturation that gives you this kind of soft feel to it. It's not big, it's not powerful. I think it's incredibly elegant, and I think it's actually a delightful drink. Most of the spirit in this is made from the light. So this is made from light marks. Most of the spirit in this would have been distilled north of 90. But bear in mind, there's a big gulf between something that's 90 and something that's 95, 96. It doesn't look like a lot, you know, it's only 5 degrees more, but in terms of aromatic profile, it's a big jump. And so you end up with I think a very delightful, elegant, clean character. It's got that little bit of character. I think it's a great rum. And is it the best rum I've ever had? Probably not. But this happens quite often in beverage consumption, where there's something big and powerful, and it always kind of grabs the headlines and grabs the attention. There's a lot to be said about things that are quite subtle and quiet, and actually there's great quality that can be achieved within that frame of reference. So big can be great, but big can also be awful. And let's be honest, there's a very fine line between being kind of subtle and precise and being bland. And I think this rum, I personally think, is on very much the right side of that line, not bland at all. Now then, Lydia, are there any kind of questions floating around?
Yes, just one,
yes.
Which I think was answered in the chat, but for the benefit of the recording, just while you're on the Don Q, is the use of cane syrup a stylistic choice or a requirement because of less fermentable sugar in modern molasses?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't know exactly. They certainly, my understanding is that they certainly are using it in order to boost the fermentable sugar levels in there. So it could be a combination of a practical choice on their part, or a stylistic choice as well, because you will get slightly different flavors from high test cane syrup than you would from blackstrap. I suspect it's a bit of both, but I don't know for absolute certain sure. There is absolutely, I mean, this is a true point, which I think is worth just flagging, that the sugar industry is getting very, very, very good at extracting sugar from molasses. So or from cane juice, which therefore means that you are getting less and less and less and less sugar in the molasses that you're buying. Now, that is potentially going to cause some issues down the track, but we shall see. But yeah, there is a kind of a falling sugar level in bulk molasses, and most distillers in the Caribbean are buying from the international market. Then some are using local product, but not huge numbers. And the way the sugar industry has shaken down, there isn't anything like the production in the Caribbean that there once was. Right. Hopefully that's answered that. Hopefully, Lydia, would you say there was another one, or was that?
No, that's everything for now.
That's everything. Okay. Right. Now then, what am I going to talk about next? I can remember. Yes, I can. We're going to Jamaica next. So, and we are going to talk about. So here it is. It's this island here. So we're going to talk about rumba, white overproof. Now, I don't want to get dragged into the whole what is overproof debate, but suffice to say that this is referring to a proof system that is entirely different from the American proof system. So the American proof system, for those of you who don't know, is 2 times ABV. So if something is 40% ABV, it's 80 degrees proof in the US system. So this is referring to a proof system that was set up and used by the British for some considerable period of time, which is called the Syke system, and the Syke system set proof at 57.14% ABV. So essentially, it was used in the UK until 1980, believe it or not, when we moved over to ABV. So, you know, something to look forward to in post-Brexit world. We might go back to it. But the overproof is a reference to the fact that it's over that number, and underproof would be under that number, because proof was 57.14. Now, there is complexity in this, but it's essentially, this isn't a labeling term that's legally controlled. But if you're seeing overproof, you are expecting to see something that has a very good brace of alcohol in it. So Worthy Park. Worthy Park is the producer of this, and Worthy Park has a long tradition of rum production, but only really came back into the rum industry relatively recently. I don't want to put it, I really should have the number off the top of my head, but I don't. But it's relatively recently they've come back into production, and the owners felt that, well, we have this cane estate, which is growing, very good cane, and we can see there are some challenges in terms of like selling cane and selling sugar products. So they thought they'd diversify into rum production, and thank God they did. So Worthy Park is made from its own, this is quite a unique thing, it's made from the estate grown cane, and they have their own sugar producing factory there. So it's all in-house generated. That is very rare. And the sugar they sell, I think, in Jamaica, I don't know if it gets beyond Jamaica. Now, what's going in here are three, I was talking to Zan, who's the export director for this last night. There are three marks that go into this. Now, Worthy Park only has one still, they have, which I'll talk about in a second, but they have two light marks in this, again, to a slightly higher strength, less aromatic profile, which are made with cultured yeast, and are actually very delightful. I've had the opportunity to try these individual marks, and they are all very delightful. The thing that's really giving this kick is the heavy mark that goes into here, and it's quite common for marks, particularly in Jamaica, I think elsewhere as well, that they give them names, and these names are quite often letter abbreviations, and this is called WPE. Now, the key thing here is that this is a long fermentation, so it's 2-3 week fermentation. So there is a lot of bacterial activity there. This isn't just yeast that are contributing at this point. And they are using ambient wild yeast, and they have this tank which kind of contains molasses, it contains cane juice and cane stalks and all sorts of things. And it's within that they are kind of generating their yeast population and a whole lot of other microbial populations as well. And then this is pitched into the fermentation to kind of get the fermentation going. Now, this generates an absolutely enormous amount of ester character. Now, this is the way they do it. There are other ways that this can be done. And we don't have the time to kind of talk about the yeast dynamics, which mean that this is what the yeast will do in these scenarios. But this generates a huge amount of aroma, and these are punchy characteristics. Now, as I said, they have one single still. It's a big still. It's a pot with a double retort. Now, people quite often think, I mean, this is quite a unique feature of Caribbean distilling. I haven't seen it elsewhere. You do get, well, thumper is essentially a retort if you know American distilling, but I haven't seen this used anywhere else, really. And what else was I going to say about that? People sometimes think it's this system that actually makes these really characterful spirits. Now, it can do, but like any pot, it just depends on how you operate it. If you operate it in a certain way and make very kind of like tight cuts or wide cuts, I can't really explain what those are. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. But it's not the machine itself that does it, it's how you're running it, but also importantly, what you're putting into it. So when we're looking at these powerful Jamaican rums, and there are a number of distilleries that make these. There's Rumfire from Rumfire from Hampden, Ray & Nephew Overproof, which is from the kind of the broader Ray & Nephew estate. So this is a thing in Jamaican production. And it's what's going in the first place. These are fermentation driven products, and the stills are just there to kind of concentrate and select. And this is a completely unaged product. So I thought it might be interesting just to quickly show you what this rum and double retort looks like. This is a very common system that you will see in the Caribbean, not just Jamaica. So you have a pot here. This you can see there's a pipe that goes from the pot down into this second vessel, which is the low wines retort. Then same again into what we call the high wines retort, and then we have the shell and tube condenser. And we have here optional extra reflux that could happen. I mean, there are various different ways in which this could be achieved. Now, if we look at how this operates, it's just a very clever and efficient system. I just need one distillation to make a spirit. So I'm going to put in, these are all approximate numbers, and I must stress these are approximate numbers and just give them as a guidance. So we put in the alcoholic wash here, and we look at what's happened at the last distillation. So I'm going to get heads, hearts, and the tails are split into two parts, high wines and low wines. So the heart goes off, that's what we're going to use. The low wines and the heads are recycled into the low wines retort, which is then filled up, and it's about 35% ABV, give or take. I mean, did say approximate numbers. High wines goes into the high wines retort, gets higher, and then we're all set up, ready to go. Apply heat here. Now, I'm going to get vapor coming off here, which is more alcoholic. So up it goes, rounds in here. The vapor going into here heats up this, causes another distillation. So I'm going to get an even stronger vapor going through here into the third vessel here. And so more vapor is going to come off, and then I can just come out straight with heads, heart, high wines, and low wines. I can come straight out with the spirit. So it kind of does a triple distillation of sorts. And it's just a very efficient way of just like going from the start to the end without having to then reload stills, which is what you'd have to do in a double pot still distillation. Very widely used, but just remember, this is a tool. I can make really gutsy spirits with this. I can make really pure spirits with this. It just depends on how I run it, on what I put into it. Now, although Worthy Park don't use this, dunder is what comes out of the pot. Lees is sometimes what's referred to as what comes out of the retorts. Now, some producers will use these in order to boost the ester character of their products, but a lot of people won't. So Worthy Park don't use their dunder or their lees, but other people do, and that's a whole other discussion. So, so here we have Worthy Park Overproof. This isn't a rum for the faint-hearted. I mean, it's strong, so it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. But what I think is incredibly good about this, why I like this particularly, is that you get the layers of all of the flavors that you kind of would expect there. It's made mostly from molasses. You get this really kind of powerful toffee caramel kind of baseline to that, and then over the top of it you get all of these super overripe, sometimes it's described as funky, hogo, and there's a variety of different ways in which this is described, but you kind of have to smell that incredibly powerful exotic set of fruity aromas that is very characteristic of what we described as high ester. Now, this isn't as high ester can be, but it's a very, very good representation of this sample and dramatically different from the Don Q. And the thing that I find very admirable about this is it's bottled at 63, but it holds its alcohol even, and I'm going to sip this at kind of as it comes off the bottle, but it holds its alcohol incredibly well. There's a real viscous, oily quality to this, and the intensity means that altogether this sits as a very balanced product. It doesn't feel hot, hard, unbalanced, or anything. Now, if you try that without dilution, clearly it's warm, without doubt, but it is incredibly well integrated. And if you're having it undiluted, once you kind of ride over that initial hit of the warmth, you have this kind of layer of complexity that kind of carries and runs. And it can be a mistake when making these, that you end up with something that's just hot, hard, and just like grrr, and doesn't have the layers of complexity that this offers. This isn't the only one that does this, but I think have a soft spot for this one. I've always enjoyed it, and I think it's a terrifically good rum. I really do. Now then, Lydia, any questions before we go on to agricole?
No, none at the moment.
None. Wow.
Yep.
Wow. Okay. Right. So let's crack on then. So now we're going to Martinique. Now Martinique's there it is on the map. It's an interesting. It's France. We're actually looking at something that is bona fide part of France, and it's subject to French law. It's subject to European law. The same is true for, so 2 islands up, you have here Guadeloupe, and that's also France as well. So there are some important things we need to consider about rum, the thing which is they're most known for, which is rum agricole, and the Martinique laws. Now, having put the sword to column stills are all rubbish, I'm now going to put the sword to there are no rules in rum, which in itself is an utter nonsense. We've looked at Puerto Rico. There are laws, local laws specifically saying what you can and can't do. You look at Jamaica, there's a GI in Jamaica. Martinique is subject to some quite particular laws, EU and French. So the first one is the more generic one, which is rum agricole. So under European law, rum agricole has to be made from cane juice, sugar cane juice, and it has to be made in one of the French overseas départements or the island of Madeira, which is obviously Portuguese. There are some great rums from Madeira if you come across them. But these are the 5 French overseas departments. So in the Caribbean, you've got Martinique and Guadeloupe, French Guiana, which is in South America, it's the north coast of South America. Mayotte and Réunion are in the Indian Ocean. Now, you do sometimes see rums from Réunion. I haven't personally seen rums from French Guiana or Mayotte. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. But what we're particularly interested in here is Martinique. Now, this is something, it's not a controversial statement, it's like, what is an agricole rum? Now, in terms of the European definition, I've just laid out very, very broad terms what an agricole rum is, but the European legislation only goes as far as Europe goes and as far as any kind of reciprocal legal arrangements that it has with other jurisdictions. So where those don't exist, agricole is not a protected term. So you will find a number of rums that are made in North America, which label themselves as agricole, which don't make themselves from cane juice, or don't really have what would be the characteristics that people would associate with agricole. That's as much on that as I really want to say. I have fairly kind of firm opinions on that, but I think it's just to be kind of aware that any legal protection is only good as far as it goes. Now, that's true for anything and everything. But that's again, I don't want to get dragged down that particular rabbit hole, but just beware of that. Now then, so that's rum agricole, Martinique AOC. Now, this is an AOC that stands for Appellation d'Origine Contrôlée, which is exactly the same as what these French wines are made of, French cheeses, French chickens, all the rest of it. Also, cognac and Armagnac are made that way too. So very, very strict and very comprehensive regulations. So we have, it has to be made from Martinique cane. Now, these are abbreviated, so this really, trust me, is not all of it. They have to be distilled in column stills. These are single continuous column stills. And the parameters of the spirit, these are legally defined. It has to be, the spirit has to come off between either 65 or 75% ABV. So this is going to be quite a characterful spirit as it comes off. Now, in very broad terms, you have what's called rhum blanc, which is rested for at least 6 weeks. Now, this will typically be done in inert vessel, stainless steel, or the like. And these are dry, these are essentially unaged. And then you have rum vieux, which has been aged in oak barrels for a minimum of 3 years. Now, there are a whole load of other, so those of you may be familiar with cognac and Armagnac, you know, you have VS, VSOP, XO. There are a number of very similar designations which exist for Martinique as well. Some of them are the same, some of them are different, which, you know, vive la différence, as they might say. So these are, broadly speaking, the rules of rum agricole as exists in the AOC for Martinique. So what we're going to get is a pretty characterful cane-driven spirit. Now, some of these are much more about the cane itself, have quite a restrained fermentation character. Some have a much more obvious fermentation character. So what we're going to be looking at here particularly is the Clermont combler. Now, this is relatively interesting in that it's from a single variety of cane. So that's unusual, but not unheard of. Mostly these things are blends of various different varieties of cane. It was chosen specifically by them because they liked the aroma. They felt it had a distinct kind of aromatic lift to it. It grows near the distillery, which and well near the grows kind of produces good cane near the distillery, which when you're dealing with cane juice is important because you need to get the cut cane to the press kind of as quickly as possible so it doesn't kind of go off. And they harvest it. This is an important point in terms of what they do after distillation. They are harvesting early in the season. Now, this is where they distill to, so it's within that range, but it's kind of into the low 70s. And they rest it for 6 to 8 months. Now, this is way beyond what they're legally required to do. And this needs to be considered as a period of, to a degree, maturation. This is actively being done so that you're going to change some of the aromatic and textural elements. So we don't commonly think of maturation as something that can happen in, maybe we do, I don't know, I made an assumption there, but maturation can happen in inert vessels. It's just different from what happens within a wooden vessel. So you're not getting anything directly from the vessel itself. You're not getting, you don't kind of like drink a can of Coke and go, oh, that was a particularly lovely taste of aluminium. You don't get flavor from the vessel itself. You don't get color, but things can change in that. The chemistry doesn't just stop. So you can get an evolution of the aromatics and you can get a softening of flavor. So that is kind of part of what they did. That's much longer than what you would normally get for most rum blanc. Now, where am I? Number 3. So this is, as I say, it's cane juice. And what I quite like about Clermont is that you get a very, very recognizably kind of characteristic and very pure cane juice character that kind of runs very kind of directly through it. So, which is kind of unmistakably cane juice. Now, as I said, you will get others that have much more fermentation character. That's kind of like the stuff that we smell on those overproof rums, where the Worthy Park, where you get a lot more of that fermentation aroma sitting in there. But this doesn't really show that. It just has this kind of very clean and pure kind of cane character, which I quite like. And texturally, it's quite different from the first 2 rums that I was talking about today. There's a softness to the Don Q. There's a big kind of richness to the rumba. This is much more kind of linear and focused and kind of tight, which might sound a little odd, but if you can have them side by side, hopefully that can sort of make some degree of sense. I do find that, particularly with the Clermont, you get this crunching dryness, and this very kind of tight, linear sort of. It's not expansive and kind of lustrous or kind of luscious on the, not luscious, kind of, words fail me for once, but it has this kind of linearity, which I think is really lovely, and it just carries this kind of cane flavor all the way through the finish, and really precisely focused on that. So that's what that's doing. And again, it's an expression of agricole, and it's doing it, I think, in a really, really interesting. I think it's really interesting. I do like it a lot, but again, massively different from the ones we've had before. What's driving that? A restrained fermentation, this cane juice character, and quite a low distillation strength, which is giving us a heap of character. So that's the combler. Now we've got one more to do, so we're probably going to run over a bit, but hey, it's rum and it's tasty. So any questions quickly, Leah, before I?
Just a bit of a more statement. Someone saying they heard about Belize agricole in inverted commas rum, would they not be able to sell that into the EU?
If they sold, so if you sold that into the EU and had agricole on the label, it would be, depending on how kind of urgently the authorities pursued it, that would be an illegal label in the EU.
Great.
Yes.
And another quick one. It said, how would you describe the meaning of a spirit being linear?
It's a tricky one. When I'm teaching this, I'm normally kind of like staring someone in the eyes and kind of going, this is what I'm. So if you had the rum bar, it has this kind of real fat richness on the sort of feel, and it's called mouth filling. And although it's dry, it has no added sugar. It has this kind of big, rich feel in the mouth. Whereas the agricole, it feels really dry, and it doesn't quite have this same kind of mouth coating feel. That's kind of what I'm kind of driving at. It's very, very difficult unless we kind of like, look, we're kind of with each other, and I know that we're tasting exactly the same thing, so I can kind of point you to exactly what I mean, but it doesn't quite have this kind of like coating feeling in the mouth that would be something that I would see as more linear. But I appreciate that these are not easy words to kind of they're tricky words to use. I absolutely understand that it's not immediately obvious what I might mean by that. Hopefully that has helped to some degree. I now apologise for my puppy barking. Right, any more?
No, that's it. Great, thank you.
No, that was it. Okay, great. So we're going to move on to Haiti. It's got its independence from France actually very, very early on. It was in the early 19th century it became an independent country, and Haiti has many, many, many unusual things about it, and not least that there are still hundreds of distilleries there, and that is in itself very, very rare. Most Caribbean islands and Caribbean countries, the industries have become very consolidated, so they will have, even Martinique, which has more than most, kind of barely gets to double figures. So but Haiti is very different, and these are very small distilleries which are operating and serving really a local market. So the reason that we have these is down to a gentleman called Luca Gargano, who runs Valier, which is an incredible kind of company that curates some pretty amazing spirits. But he's worked in collaboration with a number of these producers to bottle their spirits. So they get full credit, they get kind of full kind of recognition, but it's kind of he's taking responsibility for the bottling and the distribution. But these are spirits that just aren't that are just there for the local market, and they're just frankly, if this is what you can get at your local rum distillery, then happy days, frankly. So these are made from sugarcane juice. The variety for the one we're going to try, which is Clarence Séjoux, is crystalline. It's not a hugely long fermentation, 5 to 7 days, but they are, again, using wild yeast, and there will be a lot of ambient microflora kind of playing in that space. Now, it is batch distilled, but it's batch distilled kind of using a column in combination with a pot, which I'll talk about very briefly. And this is coming off at 55.9% because they don't do anything to proof it down. This has got no added water. This is bottled at still strength, and it's completely unaged. So this is the still. So thanks to Kate Perry and Valier for sharing these photographs. This is the sort of still arrangement that they have. These are pretty rustic affairs, but very, very effective. Interestingly, this is directly heated, which in itself is not that common now, although obviously cognac is. This is the pot here, so I'll just bring that up. This is obviously the same part here. This is, I'm reliably informed by my dear friend Maggie Campbell, this is called a puker. I shall explain its function in a second. And this is the column up here. So that's the column that goes up there. And this wooden contraption over here is what would be called a chauffeur, which is a kind of a preheating device. Now, here's a diagram I did earlier. So in very, very simple terms, what will happen in this arrangement is as follows. That's the pot, which was kind of encased in concrete, as you saw. A vapor will come out, whoops-a-daisy, vapor will come out of that into the puker, and then ideally it then goes into the column. Now, if there's any overflow or what sometimes some people might call entrainment that comes over from the pot over into here, then it kind of gets collected in here and recycled back into the pot. That's the function really of this as an item. It then goes through the column, vapors rise, liquid falls, just from how columns work. And because this is being run as a batch system, they will collect their new spirit and they will make heads and tails cuts. So this is a column that's being run as a batch. It's not being run continuously. And then any kind of liquid that gathers at the base of this column then gets recycled back into the pot. It's a remarkably common setup in a lot of very fancy modern new stills. If you look at the kind of going to those distillery that has a very expensive German still from either Carl or Holstein or some of the Coyote or some of the other producers, a lot of them are, they may not have this puker thing in the middle, but pot with a column attached and just to one side is actually quite a modern setup in what would be called a hybrid still. So I haven't included how the chauffin works. Now, typically chauffin, which literally means chauffe is heat, so vin, wine, this kind of comes from a cognac terminology. You'd be using it as part of the next batch of fermented liquid. You'd be using partly as a condensing medium. So it, as the vapor is condensing, it's then heating up the liquid that goes into the pot the next time. I haven't included that on here just for kind of sake of trying to clarity at least. So what we have with the clermont is, and this is the only one that I actually have as a bottle. So they have a lot of information on the front. So this is the village, but it also gives you the name of the distillery, that Cello, and it's, what else do we say? So it also tells you who's made it, which is Michael Sajou. So or Michel rather, and then that's obviously the name up here as well. And this is from Wild Yeast, and it gives you kind of all, it gives you that information. This is a wonderful example of a bottling company, a kind of a non-producing company, being fully and completely and brilliantly transparent about what it is that they're doing. So now this is recognizably cane juice. It has this kind of herbaceous vegetal character, but it just has this explosion of fermentation kind of stuff going on. And as I was preparing my kind of presentation earlier on today, I was just kind of running out of words. So I just kind of said, it's just a stunning spirit. It's quite challenging in some of its aromas, but no more or less than many other things that people admire. So it just has such a depth of complexity and such a kind of a length on it. It just really is. It really is quite an astonishingly good thing. It has quite a lot of punch to it. And you will also find when you try these, quite often you get kind of slightly a granular character to it, which is a reflection of creeping into the heads and tails more than maybe other people might. Now, that's not a bad thing. It's just a choice. There's no absolute definition to what is and isn't a head or a tail. But it gives this kind of other textural element to this. This has this kind of lovely, oily kind of fat richness, an incredibly well integrated heat and warmth, and just a finish that just travels and travels and travels. It's big. It's big, kind of like the rum bar is big, but it has some recognizable characteristics from these kind of powerful fermentations, but it's very different as well. So I just love these things. The general category this falls under is clermont, which is these unaged, locally sourced rums. Now, Valier bottles these and distributes them, but mostly these are just kind of bought from sort of plastic totes in the local villages. So these are very much kind of for the community spirits, and I think that's a great thing. And I think they've been very lucky to partner with someone who can really respect that integrity of what it is that they're about. So I appreciate I've run over a fraction, but there is the end of me. So that's the end of what I've got to say to a degree. Oh, thank you very much, Connors. Does anyone have any questions about the clermont or kind of more generally? I am very happy to answer those questions. Young Lydia.
I haven't received any other questions, so
haven't received any other questions. Wow, I've stunned everyone, or I've either stunned or bored everyone into silence. So
But yes, just to say thank you very much for your time, Nick, and thank you to everyone for coming. And yes, enjoy your well-earned rums.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for coming. I hope it has at least kind of shown some of the multiplicity of facets that is uncoloured rum, or uncoloured cane spirit, and yeah, absolute delight, and I hope you can enjoy some good rums this evening. So thank you all very much indeed.